Van and I were asked to do this, and we thought we'd approach it like a special sort of episode of the week on Wednesday and really have a bit of a conversation. So my name is Ben Davidson, and I am the co-host of the week on Wednesday. And joining me, as always, is the lovely, the delightful, the one and only Van Badham. How are you, Van?
Good. And unlike a typical episode of the week on Wednesday, I'm not actually in my pajamas, although the dog may pop by at any point.
So we look forward to that. The topic for tonight is obviously insecure work, and it's an important topic close to both of our hearts, not just because we are both, in effect, in insecure work ourselves, but because we have seen the impacts of insecure work more broadly. And Marx has talked about insecure work all the way back when he was writing the Communist Manifesto. This is not a new phenomenon, is it?
No, and obviously our analysis comes from a Marxist place, and Marx was very explicit about how the structuralisation of the workforce under capitalism relies on what is known as a reserve army of labour. There are three different kinds of reserve armies that exist in the Marxist analysis, all of which are used at various points to put downward pressure on wages and to maximise the profitability of capitalist enterprise. And the three different kinds of reserve army are the floating army, and these are people who are displaced from the jobs they have by technological development, mechanisation, or just the simple relocation of where jobs are. The second reserve army is the pool of workers known as the latent reserve army of labour, and these are things like women traditionally in the home who combine various combinations of hours in care work with participation in the paid labour force, depending on what the demands of capitalist production are, but also, in the traditional Marxist analysis, it's like peasants on the land and people who are there and can be tapped when that's necessary. The third community of the reserve army of labour is the stagnant community. And these are people who are on the margins of society, specifically people like the long-term unemployed, people who haven't worked for more than 12 months or more, people who are in entirely precarious economic situations. And what we understand about how this reserve army of labour functions is that it functions in two ways. One, the capitalists can adjust their labour demands based on when they need workers, how they can keep wages down. There's a really powerful disincentive towards a workforce making wage claims when a stagnant reserve army of labour is maintained. And in Australia, obviously, we've seen the intersection of this capitalist framework of analysis with a welfare state that has become increasingly punitive over generations of Liberal government. It is an absolutely horrific experience to be on the dole in Australia at the moment. We know that the amount of remuneration from the government you're expected to survive on is completely paltry. People cannot do it. The humiliation of the various job active schemes that unemployed people are forced into, things like community development programs, work for the dole, and etc., make the unemployed a community of people who are essentially used as propaganda to the employed to resist wage claims and to resist making demands for better conditions. But in order to maintain this framework, it's not just these reserve armies or that contribute to downward pressure on wages. In Australia, there are also tendencies for capitalists to, propose extraordinary technological changes to the workplace with the threat that jobs are going to be replaced by machines. We call this the Elon Musk's robot framework of policy, which is, everything will be cheaper and better and more efficient if we get rid of people altogether. Thank you, Elon, you Bond villain. Also in Australia, we know that the reserve army of labour that's tapped during labour shortages and skill shortages, which we'll talk about later, is the exploitation of foreign workers through temporary visa programs where we import a labour force. Pre-pandemic levels were 1 million people a year who are used in their de-unionised, unorganised state, very difficult to track, very difficult to organise, without democratic rights as Australian workers in order to keep downward pressure on wages. And obviously Scott Morrison's a huge fan But also in Australia, we look at a situation of structuralised underemployment. And this structuralisation of underemployment is the bedrock of maintaining an insecure work framework in the Australian workplace.
So let's talk about the underemployment phenomenon, because at the moment there's a lot of discussion about how in Australia we've reached record low unemployment rates. So theoretically more people employed than ever before. But what we are seeing is...
Well, since the 70s.
Well, since the 70s.
Yeah, more physical people, but not more larger physical percentage.
That's right. So, but we are also seeing increasing rates of underemployment. And some interesting stats came out that in January, there were 159 million fewer hours worked in Australia than there were in December. And December was down 105.5 million hours from March 2020. So that's partly driven by a decline in participation rate. It's partly driven by some of the jobs that were lost during the pandemic. And I shouldn't say lost, because jobs are never lost. You don't misplace a job. Jobs are destroyed. There's an active decision taken there. But the jobs that were destroyed were replaced by less secure jobs. And how do we know that? Well, we know that now thank you to the ATO. There's now a mechanism through the payroll system where we're able to see payroll jobs. So previously we captured unemployment and we started to capture underemployment as measured by the ABS. But now the ATO also captures payroll jobs. And a payroll job is effectively a job where you're on the payroll. It may still be casual, but it's more likely than a non-payroll job to have entitlements. So we know that payroll jobs are down about 6% from December. So there's a number of statistical indicators, data indicators that suggest there is an increasing amount of underemployment and insecurity in the Australian workforce. We also know that we're an outlier when it comes to the OECD on these issues, right? So we know that the OECD doesn't really capture casuals because Australia is one of the few countries that has casual employment.
So we've known for years that there's been increasing casualisation in the Australian workforce. There's particularly hard data around what happened to academic jobs in Australia, where academia, which used to be one of the safest jobs you can have because of the tenure system, became the industry with the highest amount and most rapid amount of casualisation of them all. And we know that Australia has around 40%, and these have been standard statistics that long predate the pandemic, that 40% of Australians are in insecure work. I have 4 university degrees. I have never been in a permanent job, and I've worked in 5 different industries over the course of my working life. And I'm absolutely captured in the insecure work community completely, totally, despite my level of qualification and the kind of work that I do. Ben is a recent entrant to the wonderful world of insecure work, and hasn't he loved it? Chirpy, happy faces all around, especially waiting for invoices, one of the great joys of it. But this rapid casualisation, Ben is right, is completely atypical. In Germany, about 10 years ago, when the work casualisation rate hit 20%, they determined it was a national crisis and had tripartite discussions between government, business and the union movement in order to restructuralise permanent work into the economy. Even in Britain, which has a high level of work casualisation, which I have had the unfortunate £8 an hour, no rights, 0 hours contract experience of working in, you are legally obliged to convert casuals to permanents after 4 years on the job. And after a year, you're obliged to pay workers redundancy. So there are ceilings and basements to the way that the way that casual work is structured in other countries. And certainly in the EU, there's a focus on a permanent role for part-time labour as opposed to constantly renewing contracts that we have in Australia. The fact that this has become normalised to us as a workforce is an absolutely terrible sign, because it begins to resemble the place where workplace rights go to die. And which country is that, Ben?
The United States of America.
It's a terrible, terrible place to be a working class person.
One of the great kind of capitalist mythos of the post-pandemic era that's coming primarily out of the United States is this idea of the Great Resignation. And it's being driven by this view that now lots of people are leaving their jobs because there's some new opportunities as a result of the pandemic, and they're going and taking better jobs. There's a lot of media commentary in Australia starting to try and talk about this in a similar way. But Van, you've uncovered, I'm going to say uncovered because it was news to me, some interesting facts about what's happening in the great capitalist free market, free nightmare that is the United States labour market. And perhaps the Great Resignation is not so much a great resignation as it is a great forcing out.
Okay, so the mythology of the Great Resignation in the United States of America was when the pandemic hit, and of course, America didn't have a JobKeeper system. It had a couple of checks. It doesn't have anything structured like a comprehensive welfare state that you'd expect in a modern progressive country. In the United States, the power to fire is inherently with the employer. There's no unfair dismissal as we would understand it in Australia. And certainly when the pandemic began, there were mass layoffs. The mythology of the Great Resignation is that over the course of the pandemic, people just really liked being at home and found a really great work-life balance and realized that their kids were super important to them and were in a position to, make demands of better jobs. As America started to reopen, there was all of a sudden in the United States what there hadn't been in a really long time, which was a huge proportion of available jobs compared to workers. So there's something like 10 million job opportunities when pandemic restrictions started to lift, as opposed to 7 million people who were looking for work. And what happened in the United States was that for the first time in generations, workers felt confident due to the shortage of labour there to make demands around the workplace, around rates of pay and conditions, and would travel to where jobs were and were very comfortable with job mobility. And the mythology was that this was because of this work-life balance thing. The truth is that America has had this very rare window of increased labour power where workers have felt confident to make those demands and wages have gone up in that context. But the reason why there is now this gap between those looking for work and the jobs available is because women left the workforce at a rate of 2 to 1 during the pandemic. And they did that because generations of divestment in aged care and childcare in the United States meant that during the pandemic, when children were obliged to be at home because schools were closed, because there were no support services in the United States, because there is, a totally threadbare and inadequate welfare state, that women were forced out of the labour market merely to just maintain the supervision of children. The loss of working mothers from the United States labour market has actually been increasing every year since 2008, which was, of course, the year of the global financial crisis. And what that's meant is that the increases experienced by workers in the United States are almost entirely gendered, as the workforce has become a prohibitive experience for particularly working mothers to engage. It is more expensive to work and put your children in childcare across the United States overwhelmingly than it is for you to just stay out of the workforce. And I mean, this is a huge problem in terms of long-term American productivity, because you're literally confining half of your nation's brains to the domestic sphere merely to keep households functional and children out of danger. And that's the basis of the Great Resignation. It's not this wonderful moment of awakened labour power and a sudden collective realisation that, working people deserve more. It's a structural disincentive for women to work. And it's of concern because obviously the context in Australia is where we've seen divestment and some of the worst working conditions, especially during the pandemic, has been obviously in the aged care, disability care and childcare sectors, which in Australia have some of the most gendered workforces of any comparable workforces in the world. Childcare in Australia and early childhood education is 97% a feminised workforce. And what we know is that in periods of greater exploitation, and Ben can talk a little about what's happened in areas such as aged care and disability care, the participation of private equity and just monstrous outsourced capitalist money-making machines applied to care communities is looking at the same denigration of workers' rights, restriction of opportunity, and the same kind of pressures that exist in America can be imposed on an Australian workforce and households as well.
And on that point, in Australia, we have seen, if we go back to those payroll jobs data, which is it's an interesting, relatively new stat, there was a decline in healthcare and social assistance jobs, 3.9% decline in those jobs, even though we know from employers, from unions, from anecdotal evidence that there has been an increasing demand for workers in those sectors and, in fact, increasing numbers of workers in those sectors. I know I'm on the board of HESTA. We've seen, certainly, there's no question, increasing numbers of members because our members come from those sectors. So why is there a decreasing number of payroll jobs in that sector? It's because there has been a larger increase in the amount of Uberization. So this is where the platforms have come in and you have essentially digital sham contracting, shifting people out of traditional, permanent, ongoing, secure work, whether it be part-time or full-time, however it's structured, into essentially the gig economy. So it's not a foregone conclusion that a technology platform has to reduce workers' rights or workers' wages, but what we're seeing in these sectors is the application of those technologies to do exactly that. So the NDIS, for example, will require, and the Senate committee reported this last week, will require 83,000 more full-time workers over the next 2 years. At the moment, the rapid growth of employment in that sector is really only happening in the ABN and contracting part of the NDIS. That's quite a disturbing trend when you think about where the growth of jobs is going to be. And again, to come back to your point, Van, they're often in predominantly feminised industries. You're talking about disability support care, you're talking about aged care, childcare, this increasing shift towards structural insecurity of employment, which of course puts downward pressure again on wages, to come back to your original points about Marx. It's potentially a pretty bleak picture that we're painting. We don't like to do that on the Week on Wednesday because, the thing that, as I said before, people make decisions, right? None of these things are inevitable, and we do have decisions that we can make that change some of this. So there was some of the research that you found around training, for example, that Australia has shifted away from training our own workers to using more imported temporary migrant workers, but we could make a decision to invest more in training, couldn't we?
Yeah, we could. So the issue around the skilling of workers and shortages in the labour market is actually really crucial as well, because it is whenever the warning from, I think he's the head of the business school at Sydney University, Buchanan, who's one of the economists who talks about labour shortages and their relationship to skills in Australia. He talks about how whenever you hear industry complain about skill shortages, it's actually a smoke and mirrors for their abscondment from their own responsibility. So in 2005, more than a third of workplaces offered on-the-job training and skills development for its employees. Now it's barely more than a fifth. There has been a massive decline in the investment in worker development and skilling up in the private workplace. So it's just not happening on any kind of scale. The argument made by industry is that labour shortages exist because there's a mismatch between the community of the Australian unemployed who don't have the skills they want, and the workers who they want, who they refuse to train. And this is actually the pretext that goes into Liberal policy announcements about wanting to re-import temporary workers and guest workers from overseas. It's another means by which employers are abandoning any kind of responsibility to a local workforce and instead exploiting imported labour in the worst possible way, with the flow-on effect that we have 800,000, I think it's 800,000 unemployed people in Australia, with industry wanting to import 1 million workers from overseas. Obviously, the maths there are not in favour of the local community.
And it is about policy decisions, because we know that governments can legislate or can regulate to have minimum apprenticeship ratios on major projects. We know that in other countries there is a requirement to have training budgets and training allocations for staff for companies of certain sizes. There are lots of things that can be done in this space, but of course the neoliberal framework that the Morrison government applies to this is not about employment and skills and nation building development. It's about lowering the cost of workers as a unit of labour, right?
Yeah, and it's that old American saying that they say, left-wing people say around minimum wage in the United States, that anybody who's arguing against minimum wage is somebody who would pay you nothing if they thought they could get away with it. And it's the same when we talk about the problem in Australia with job security. So data that Ben and I went through today as we were preparing found that the fear of losing a job and the fear that a job is insecure is the dominant fear of workers in the Australian workforce. 60% of workers cite that as their number one concern. They are less concerned about mechanisation, digitisation.
It's 80% are concerned about losing their job, and 60% are concerned about losing their job to a gig economy job.
Sorry, my apologies.
It's even worse. It's even worse, if you can believe it. So they're huge numbers, right?
They are huge numbers, and people are right to fear. The most extraordinary people who have promoted gig economy models in Australia. Senator Nick McKim from the Greens made his maiden speech in the Parliament when he became a federal senator in praise of Uber, and recommended that Uberised models of employment be expanded to childcare and labour hire. The motivation towards building this extremely stratified economy, where we have seen the absolute exploitation of American workers, which is creating a permanent, indentured, precarious underclass in cities as prosperous as San Francisco in the United States, where you see workers holding down multiple gig economy jobs and managing this almost impossible logistics merely to meet basic living expenses. There has been pressure for the introduction of that kind of framework, an expansion of employment in Australia. It's absolutely outrageous.
And we did see a good outcome in the New South Wales Industrial Relations Commission in the last sort of 7 days, where Amazon flex drivers have been granted a minimum wage. But we've also seen, as Billy alluded to before, some pushback at a high court level that says it's really just the contract that binds a worker to an employer, and that can be essentially as exploitative as the two parties agree to it to be. And just to bring it to the context of the pandemic a little bit, Van, we saw during the pandemic how the insecurity of employment actually fueled the spread of the virus, didn't
Absolutely.
we? So we saw insecure workers working across multiple hotels, in quarantine hotels, spreading the virus. We saw delivery drivers effectively spreading the virus. We saw people who had no choice but to go to work even when they were sick, spreading the virus.
Well, this was one of the first public infections of coronavirus in Australia. Was a hospo worker in Tasmania who was feeling sick, who had, I believe, returned from overseas, and went to work with symptoms because he had no choice. Like, he was dependent on the income and literally could not afford to not work, despite the fact that he was one of the early carriers of coronavirus. And, there was outrage from the tabloids and the government at the time. But as somebody who has been in insecure work my entire life, especially when I went in hospital, I went into work sick all the time. I caught swine flu in the United Kingdom and went to work in the snow, like something from a Dickens novel because I had literally no other options. I could not afford Tamiflu, which was the it was one of the medications I had to take. The Tamiflu was free. It was all the stuff to treat the pain. I couldn't afford it unless I worked while I was so sick. I was parexic. And that's the reality of, this insecure, casualised, unstable workforce. And of course, the fact that in Australia, we've kept seeing the pattern of infections in aged care, in the most vulnerable sections of the community and the workplace, because there are no protections for sick workers.
And we also saw that government can step in, and we did see in some states governments regulate to say, no, you have to be employed just in one medi-hotel or one aged care facility. And for, brief moments of time during the pandemic, governments step up and regulate this.
The lady sent an email.
Insecurity of this pandemic of insecurity that was spreading this pandemic of a virus. Of course, a lot of those things was deemed sort of emergency measures and have since been rolled back. And now again, we see, as you say, aged care, you've got people working across multiple sites. Again, in hospitality, we're seeing insecurity of work once again, spreading the illness.
But Ben's right. It is a matter of policy, and it's a matter of choice. And the experience of the pandemic, I think, for all of us, especially in the nervous days when Scott Morrison, frankly, didn't know what to do and the IPA hadn't briefed him yet, was to move extremely quickly on various workplace protections and conditions. For example, providing free childcare, which was literally life-saving for entire families and communities. Things like JobKeeper, as flawed as it was with the transfer of vast amounts of wealth to private enterprise, which was completely disgusting. But the principle of maintaining wage subsidies during the pandemic that kept people connected to their jobs and their workplaces, all of these things that happen in, the shoddy, incompetent way that, Liberals do, and neo-Keynesianism.
And being driven there by unions.
And outraged communities and, polls on fire. But it showed absolutely that the capacity of government for economic settings that actually benefit workers' communities and restore expectation in Australian egalitarianism are absolutely, they are present and they have the capacity to be immediate, and that restructuralisation of the workforce. And I think it was even you can imagine, Ben and I are not huge fans of neoliberalism, and we've become very jaded about its pursuit in certain political quarters and the way that some people have remained wedded to it as an ideology, even though trickle-down economics is nonsense and it clearly screws people over. At the same time, even we were surprised by just how quickly those settings could be changed, but through government will, even by Tories, and in that context. So the idea that we are too far gone, that the end of history that was proposed in the 1990s, this notion that neoliberalism was, the triumph of the West and forever, and the most logical resource allocation system, was upended incredibly quickly. It actually gives us a lot of hope that the Keynesian settings that informed an imperfect post-war prosperity. Can you imagine Keynesian economies with participation of women and groups traditionally marginalised from the workforce? How extraordinary to consider full employment settings in a context of accessible workplaces or remote working and those kind of participatory workplace environments. Those things are actually possible. And liberation from a capitalist setting that exploits the most vulnerable people in society in the workplace and beyond it in a marginalised reserved army of labour, perpetuating long-term employment structurally as punishment and as a punitive means of discouraging wage claims from people who are working. Those things can actually be overcome by policy decisions incredibly quickly.
And now we have not just international experiences and international examples, which we've had for some time. We have real live domestic examples. And I think the New South Wales Industrial Relations decision on Amazon Flex and delivery drivers starts to give us some hope that there are changing institutional attitudes as well. So there are lots of lots of levers government can pull on policy. There are actual levers that institutions can pull as well. And of course, at a community level, we're seeing unions organise, and even just the last 2 days, the conversation around the difference between strike and lockout is started to really drive a community understanding about the importance and power of unionism.
And wasn't it satisfying to watch the Transport Minister in New South Wales have to back down completely today after his lockout yesterday and do his mea culpa and announced that they were no longer suing the union and they might actually participate in some bargaining after all. And I'd like to thank all of my comrade brothers and sisters from the RTBU for just playing that so sweetly and superbly. And the minister was literally purple in the press conference. I recommend everybody have a look at the picture. You'll feel a lot more confident about the capacity of humanity.
So, I mean, we could talk about insecure work forever because there are so many facets to it. We haven't touched on what it means for the household economy when people don't have security of employment. We haven't touched on what it means in terms of the consumer participation. There's lots of elements to it. But I'm also keen that this is a Fabians event, and there will be some very intelligent and smart people who are sharing this event with us, who probably have some questions they'd like to ask us. But before I do that, Van, is there anything else that we really want to convey to people?
Is there anything else we want to convey? Well, generally, Ben and I are like, hey, why aren't you a member of a union? I would presume at a Fabians event, everybody has been members of unions. But certainly, Ben and I make this recommendation whenever we do the Week on Wednesday, because certainly where we are seeing resistance in Australia to, that's our dog who is participating in the chat, where we see in Australia there has been resistance, particularly to platform provision of jobs and this online framework of,
digital sham contracting.
Things like the work of Unions New South Wales and taking Airtasker to task and looking at that as a platform of potential exploitation and really driving home minimum wage, award wages and conditions in that particular platform. Obviously, the TWU has worked extremely hard organising Deliveroo drivers. Like where unions are building density in those particular spaces, we're seeing an an improvement in the power dynamics of those as workplace conditions. So, we rest assured bang that the drum of unionism very hard whenever we do a Week on Wednesday episode. And apparently Ben and I are phenomenal recruiters, as we have our own membership link that people who listen to our podcast use to join their union. AustralianUnions.org.au/wow. We get no commission from that, by the way, just so that we're very clear. But it is absolutely important. And we are seeing the expansion of that digital sham contracting model into the growing spheres around health and community services. We're seeing now, even in things as technical as the legal sphere, accounting, there's a growing body of insecure digital sham contracting. And it doesn't have to be that way because there are other alternatives. We've seen Menulog try and strike an agreement with the TWU. We're seeing HireUp, which is a disability service provider that I've had some engagement with, actually employ people. Yes, mostly casual at this stage, but there is a growing division between those who see technology as enabling productivity and actually giving workers some control, and those who simply see it as a new whip with which to create insecure work. So that is this very special sort of Week on Wednesday Fabians edition for Tuesday night.